Welcome to this explainer on Anglo Saxon society. Today, we're going to explore a world defined by a strict, yet surprisingly fluid social hierarchy. We're stepping right back into pre-Norman Britain to uncover exactly how power, wealth, and basic survival were balanced in a kingdom that was constantly teetering on the edge of warfare. It's a really fascinating setup, so let's dive in. Here's our roadmap for the day. We'll start with part 1, a hostile and changing land, followed by 2, kings and powerful earls, and 3, Thulgans, the warrior aristocracy. Then we'll look at 4, sea earls and the peasant majority, 5, slavery and unfree labor, and we'll wrap up with 6, a surprisingly fluid society. All right, let's jump right into section 1, a hostile and changing land. To truly understand Anglo-Saxon society, you really have to understand its geography and its enemies. The areas of Britain controlled by Anglo-Saxons had fluctuated wildly over the centuries. I mean, picture this. You're surrounded by hostile neighbors on absolutely all sides. You've got Wales, Scotland, and Ireland to the west and north, and Normandy down to the south. Plus, they were constantly dealing with the chaotic aftermath of massive Viking invasions that had repeatedly seized and lost vast amounts of territory. Because of this relentless pressure, this entire society was naturally built around warriors, loyalty, and above all, protection. Which brings us perfectly to section 2, kings and powerful earls. At the absolute pinnacle of this highly defensive social structure was the king. He was the wealthiest and most important person in the land, for sure. But, heavy is the head that wears the crown. He carried the massive responsibility of defending the country from those constant attacks we just talked about. Beyond just warfare, he was expected to pass good laws, make sure those laws were actually obeyed, maintain general order, and keep a tight grip on the church. He was literally the anchor of the entire society. Now, directly beneath the king were the earls, and earls are first crucial vocabulary word for today. Earls were the most important aristocrats right after the king himself. They owned massive areas of land and governed entire regions of England on his behalf. They acted as his closest advisors, kept law and order in their territories, and, crucially, they were the ones responsible for raising armies to fight for the crown. It was a really delicate balancing act. The king granted the earls land, and in return, he demanded absolute, total loyalty. With usually no more than 6 earls in the entire country at any given time, these men fiercely competed against each other. They all wanted to be the one the king trusted and relied on the most to get the greatest rewards. And sometimes, these highly ambitious earls would even challenge the king himself to seize a bit more power. Moving down the ladder, we hit section 3, the Thens, the warrior aristocracy. Below the earls, making up less than 1% of the population, along with the rest of the nobility, was this absolutely crucial warrior class. These were the Thanes. A Thane was basically a local lord and a core member of the warrior aristocracy. Some of them were king's thanes, who held land directly from the monarch and served him personally, while others held their land from those powerful earls. They were the backbone of local administration, doing things like organizing road repairs and guarding the tax collectors. To actually be a thane, land ownership was the golden ticket. Specifically, you needed more than 5 hides of land. A hide is our next key term. It's essentially a unit of land measurement used for tax purposes. But honestly, just having 5 hides wasn't enough. To truly hold this elite status, a thane also had to live in a manor house, complete with its own tower and a separate church. You needed the whole setup to be in the club. And when a man officially became a thane, he had to pay a very specific tax known as a heriot. Heriot literally translates to war gear. This tax required the thane to fully equip himself with a helmet, a coat of mail, a horse with a harness, a sword, and a spear. It was a brilliant system, really, because it guaranteed that the kingdom always had this highly equipped elite defense force ready to fight at a moment's notice. By the year 1060, this elite warrior aristocracy was tightly capped at just 4,000 to 5,000 men. Just think about that for a second. A nation constantly under threat of invasion relied on a highly trained, heavily armored corps of just a few thousand local lords to hold the defensive line for the entire country. Okay, let's look at section 4, senior earls and the peasant majority. Now we're moving down to the vast majority of the people, the ones actually working the land to support these nobles. The sheer scale of the social divide here is pretty staggering. The nobility made up less than 1% of society, while standard peasants made up over 70%. And sandwiched on either side of that massive peasant majority were two other distinct groups, each making up about 10% of the population. Let's look at that unique 10% just above the regular peasants first. Roughly 10% of the population were ceorals. A ceoral was a high-status free peasant who owned their own small piece of farmland. Because they were free, their tasks were way less centered around intense manual labor, and they actually had the right to pack up and choose a completely different lord to work for if they wanted to. Though, like all free males, ceorals were still required to serve in the army during wartime. So, the vital takeaway here is the stark difference between a free ceoral and a standard peasant farmer. Regular peasants rented small farms and had to work their lord's land for up to 3 days a week doing whatever he asked, like hauling animals to market. On their off days, they frantically farmed to survive and pay rent, which was usually paid in goods like pigs, eggs, or milk. If they didn't do the required work for the lord, they lost their land entirely. Meanwhile, the ceorals got to completely avoid this grueling weekly labor requirement. Now we have to look at the bottom tier in Section 5, slavery and unfree labor. At the very bottom of the Anglo Saxon social pyramid, we find a much darker reality. Making up an estimated 10% of the entire population were unfree slaves. These individuals had absolutely no land and were entirely stripped of their freedom. They worked on their lord's land or in his household as servants, and they were legally bought and sold. Their masters dictated every single aspect of their lives: how much they worked, the exact food they ate, and sometimes even who they were allowed to marry. While the later Norman conquerors actually viewed this practice as completely barbaric, we have to impartially note that it was entirely normalized for the Anglo Saxons. In fact, it was so deeply ingrained in their legal view of property that if a slave committed a crime, they were often punished less harshly than a free person. Why? Well, simply because severely injuring a slave would damage their ability to work, and they were viewed more as valuable property than as human beings. Finally, we arrive at Section 6, a surprisingly fluid society. Here is where Anglo-Saxon society completely subverts our modern assumptions about rigid, unchanging medieval hierarchies. In other parts of Europe at the time, particularly in neighboring Normandy, your status in society depended heavily on ancestry. Who your family was permanently dictated your path in life. But the Anglo-Saxon system was much less rigid. In England, social status was tied directly to wealth and land ownership, which meant that incredible social mobility was actually possible. Look at how this actually worked in practice. A common peasant who prospered, acquired 5 hides of land, and paid tax could literally gain elite noble status and become a thegn. A merchant taking bold risks making foreign trips in his own ships could do the exact same thing, and a thegn could even be elevated to an earl. Wealth and action could fundamentally change your stars. But, as you might guess, mobility went both ways. Powerful earls who fell out of favor could be quickly demoted back down to the thanes. Masters could choose to free their slaves, giving them a chance at a new life. And in truly desperate times, a free peasant might tragically have to sell themselves into slavery just to secure enough food to keep their family alive. The societal ladder was constantly shifting based on fortune, favor, and basic survival. Which leaves us with a really provocative final thought for this explainer. We so often view history as this straight line of progress, right? But considering this remarkable social fluidity based on land and enterprise, was this ancient pre-conquest Anglo-Saxon society actually more meritocratic than the supposedly advanced, ancestry-obsessed Norman civilization that soon conquered it? It's a fascinating question that challenges a lot of what we think we know about the medieval world. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and keep questioning the past.